안녕하세요. Greetings. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you at Peace Dream. My name is Chris Rice. I'm speaking to you from New York City, and I serve with the Mennonite Central Committee as director of our United Nations office. MCC is a faith-based NGO working in 53 countries. Relief, development, and peace. Here you can see the countries where we serve, including the Korean Peninsula. Our organization is over 100 years old. And here in New York City, we have an office that engages the United Nations for advocacy related to the countries where MCC is working for relief, development, and peace. My lecture to you is constructive engagement with North Korea. And added to that, from division and reunification to reconciliation. My lecture has 3 parts. Part 1 is about my journey in the work of reconciliation, social healing, and the need for what I call moral imagination. In part 2, I will discuss 3 challenges and obstacles to social healing on the Korean Peninsula. In part 3, finally, I will offer 4 transformative practices of social healing on the Korean Peninsula. So, part 1, moral imagination and my journey of reconciliation. The convictions that we have as human beings about our world are profoundly shaped by our journeys of life. My own life journey has been profoundly shaped by a quest for reconciliation. I actually grew up 어렸을 때 서울에서 살았어요. I grew up in Seoul as the son of Presbyterian missionaries, and several times tensions between North and South broke out, and it seemed a war might even happen. At the time, I could feel the fear, but I could also feel the deep Korean longing for reunion. After Korea, for 17 years, I lived in Mississippi, the US state perhaps most affected by racism, racial injustice. In Mississippi, I was part of a social change organization of Blacks and white people who worked together for justice and healing. After that, for 14 years at Duke University, I helped found the Duke Center for Reconciliation. That work drew me to East Africa, where we began an initiative of reconciliation involving leaders from countries including Rwanda, Uganda, the Congo, South Sudan, and Burundi. Then, following Duke, for 5 years, my wife Donna and I lived in South Korea, in Chuncheon, from 2014 to 2019 as Northeast Asia directors for Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC. During those 5 years with MCC, I traveled into North Korea 6 times, guiding MCC's humanitarian work in North Korea. And now I serve as the director of MCC's United Nations office in New York City, where the Korean Peninsula is a very high priority. Now, MCC works on both sides of the Korean divide. 2 countries, 1 mission of reconciliation. Our staff in South Korea includes South Koreans. Our director there is South Korean. All these contexts, Mississippi, East Africa, Korean Peninsula, all are places of rich beauty and culture. They are also places of profound distrust, social division, historical wounds, and injustices. In each place, I've been deeply involved in work across divides, seeking social healing and reconciliation. So when I say constructive engagement with North Korea, I am speaking about toward a new future of healing between Korean people, North and South. This immediately raises a question of the extent to which Korean people desire a new future of healing. When it comes to race, racial division, racial injustice in my country of America, historically, many saw separation, injustice between white lives and Black lives as normal and even natural. But this way of seeing is itself part of the problem. In a similar way, for many, the divide between North and South Korea has come to be seen as normal, natural, even inevitable. But I believe, personally, this way of seeing the Korean people, this imagination is also central to the problem, speaking from the other places where I have worked. Peace scholar John Paul Lederach says that deep change in places of deep division requires what he calls moral imagination. Moral imagination, namely, quote, the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenge of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist, unquote. Pursuing reconciliation instead of division requires a shift of moral imagination. It requires holding together things that are normally held apart, both truth and mercy, justice and peace, confronting oppression and offering forgiveness. A new relationship of trust between strangers and enemies requires courage, sacrifice, time. Social healing cannot be done in a bali way. It requires time, a long time. In fact, the work of healing takes as much time as the years of division. In this 70th anniversary year of the Korean War armistice and a divided peninsula, social healing will take time. Healing requires a different approach from reunification. Reunification is seen as a political concept. Reconciliation is a moral concept. It is not economic or political self-interest, which leads towards social healing. Only moral imagination can do that. So a more accurate title for my lecture is From Division and Reunification to Reconciliation. Now let's move to part 2, Challenges Facing Social Healing on the Korean Peninsula. The first challenge facing social healing: contested South Korean identities toward reunification. I propose that 4 prevailing identities regarding North Korea can be seen in today's South Korean society and historically. Each of these 4 ways of seeing North Korea embodies a very different approach to the future between the 2 divided countries. As is true of any long history of conflict, these identities often overlap and mix within individuals and society to concoct a turbulent and often volatile climate. Those 4 identities: enemy nation, another country, disadvantaged sibling, ruptured family. Enemy nation, another country, disadvantaged sibling, ruptured family. Let me talk about each one of those, and I look forward to our discussion about this. The first South Korean identity sees North Korea as enemy nation. From 1950 to 1953, as you well know, over 2 million Koreans were killed during the war, mostly civilians. Sebastian Kim describes the wounds that emerged. Quote, "The war caused a deep scar of resentment toward the other side in hearts and minds of both South and North Koreans. And until today, the memory of cruelty by both parties has haunted any attempt at reconciliation. During the brief period of occupation of the other's territory, both parties committed killings, torture, kidnapping of civilians, accusing them of being either communist aggressors or collaborators with American imperialists," unquote. In the 70 years since 1953, with little opportunity for healing the scars of resentment through encounter with one another, a deep sense of victimhood in search of justice took root among many in the older generation, especially, who experienced trauma. This shapes an identity of a holy pursuit to resist the evil of atheist communism. With this first South Korean identity of North Korean as enemy nation, coexistence is not seen as possible until North Korea is cleansed. The corresponding vision of the future is regime change in North Korea, whether brought by collapse, military force, or Christian evangelization. With an estimated 1 million North Korean troops across a border that lies just 35 miles from Seoul, this identity is supported by the historic militarization of South Korean society. And you know much about that, about the conscription by law of South Korean men into the military and national security laws, etc. The second dominant South Korean identity regards North Korea as another country. Over 70 years of complete separation under two drastically different systems of life, ideology, economics, government, an identity has developed that sees the two Koreas as two different cultures, two different nations. Many in the younger generation, especially, I believe, think this way. They never knew a united Korea, did not experience war or trauma, have no family members in the North that they have ever met, unlike perhaps their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. This identity is reinforced by reports of the enormous economic cost of reunification. South Korean youth might reasonably ask, why bother with reunification? What's the benefit for me? Also, despite any threatening rhetoric from North or South, daily life in South Korea carries on as usual, most of the time, without the urgency of a clear and present danger. The status quo of two different nations and cultures with different interests has come to be seen as natural and normal. This identity of another country does not see reunification to be worth the effort and sacrifice. The corresponding vision of a future with North Korea is one where the peninsula remains divided. That is, a kind of benign apartheid that leaves the status quo intact. Apartheid in the sense of two separate people going their separate ways. I propose that a third South Korean identity regards North Korea as disadvantaged sibling. With only 50 million citizens, South Koreans emerged from post-war poverty to develop the world's 11th largest economy, with South Korean cars, phones, K-pop music, K-dramas valued across the world. The corresponding understanding of unification is described by scholar Andrei Lankoff. Quote, "It is always accepted that the new unified state will be run in accordance with South Korean economic and political model. No serious concessions to the North Korean model, widely seen as inferior, are going to be allowed or considered," unquote. This identity looks across the border with confidence and sees an isolated, disadvantaged country that, given the chance, would enthusiastically embrace the South's way of life, at least the people in the North. The related vision of the future is one of unification by absorption, namely, a process of assimilation through which people of North Korea are gradually welcomed into the system of the South. Finally, the fourth South Korean identity sees North Korea as ruptured family. This understanding is seen in President Kim Dae-jung's words in 2000 after returning from North Korea, from Pyongyang. He said, "The Pyongyang people are the same as us, the same nation sharing the same blood," unquote. Deep down, perhaps most South Koreans affirm this understanding of a fundamental Korean we, Korean uri, but they vehemently, strongly disagree over the political form that this took in President Kim Dae-jung's so-called sunshine policy. That is, an iceberg of hostility melts by warmth and encouragement, not by Cold War. A policy which reversed the previous 50 years of antagonism. Scholar Kirstine Kim describes an approach which is starkly different from that antagonism. The sunshine policy changed the rhetoric completely by recognizing the humanity and dignity of North Koreans and engaging with them. This policy aimed at peaceful coexistence of the two Koreas, in which the South pledged neither to provoke North Korea, the enemy nation approach, nor to seek to absorb it, the disadvantaged sibling approach. The corresponding vision of the future with North Korea is one of mutual respect regarding sovereignty of both countries and seeks economic cooperation, perhaps leading to a federation. This approach lasted from 1998 to 2008. Reunifications intensified between divided families, economic cooperation was established, and South Koreans engaged in much humanitarian work with North Koreans. Now, while these four South Korean identities regarding North Korea conflict with each other, they also have fluidity. Multiple identities can be even held together at the same time. Paradoxical tension, a kind of love-hate relationship, perhaps, with North Korea. These four identities are bitterly contested. They carry enormous implications for national identity, values, and policies. The another country identity can be seen as fleeing, perhaps, from tension that must be squarely faced. Approaching North Korea as disadvantaged sibling can be criticized as a kind of version of colonialism, seen in the well-documented difficulties of the 30,000 North Korean escapees, refugees now living in the South, often welcomed not as equals, but treated as a kind of different ethnic group, struggling in a strange land they do not easily embrace. From the enemy nation side, terms of contempt such as Chongbuk, follower of the North, Balgengi, red partisan, communist, have been used to label pro-engagement and pro-sunshine politicians and advocates as unpatriotic and even traitorous. Indeed, following President Kim Dae-jung, his protege Roh Moo-hyun were two presidencies that dismantled the sunshine policy. And that policy and the ruptured family approach can be seen as naive and unrealistic. Tragically, churches in South Korea are caught up in this hostile climate of disunity. Many Christians who are in the North experienced great suffering before and during the war and then fled to the South. Churches they established in the South aligned themselves with anti-North governments. A small but vocal minority of other church bodies have kept the ruptured family identity at the forefront and instead pursued channels of engagement with the North. The church's disunity stretches to conflicting views about the U.S., about the U.S.'s longstanding military power and presence in the South. Furthermore, those on both sides of this church divide might believe that God is on their side. The second challenge facing social healing, the danger of a single story. With unhealed wounds and divides comes a danger. The Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has spoken about the danger of a single story, the danger of a single story. As she explains, single stories reduce an entire group of people to one way of seeing them. Here's what she said. If you show a people, an entire people group as one thing, only one thing, over and over again, that is what they become. The single story creates stereotypes. This is very important what she says. The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the whole story. So single stories carry truth, but they don't carry the whole truth. And they result in a problem when it comes to social healing. In the US, for example, news about North Korea often focuses on a single story, the threat of nuclear attack and tense political relations. And that's a true story. But as a result of this single story, in the US, few Americans may see the country beyond the risk it poses to the US. Meanwhile, with 70 years of no peace agreement, no encounters with North Korean people, and few at the diplomatic level, Americans have had little, actually really no opportunity to learn more from the 26 million people in North Korea who live there. I once met a general, a US general from the US military, a very, very high commanding officer who had served in South Korea. And I asked him, what was the greatest danger in the relationship between North Korea and the US? And his reply surprised me. According to him, the danger was not military buildup or nuclear weapons. He said the greatest danger was North Koreans don't understand Americans and the way Americans think. Americans don't understand North Koreans and the way North Koreans think. And South Koreans don't understand the way North Koreans think, and North Koreans don't understand the way South Koreans think. That, he said, was the greatest danger. He said the greatest danger was a lack of empathy. This is a military general. 70 years after the trauma of the Korean War, the mutual animosities still run deep. The distrust still runs deep. With essentially no contact allowed between Koreans across the divide, creating empathy is almost impossible. And single stories of the threatening other easily become the whole story. Let me now speak to the third challenge, facing social healing, the power of the United States. These are not the only challenges, but I'm naming a few, and this is the third one that I'll name. American people have a long and complicated history with Northeast Asia and Korea. Prior to the Korean War, hundreds of American missionaries worked with South Korean people to help plant churches across the country. For decades, the U.S. has had a very significant military presence in South Korea. When I was growing up in South Korea in the 1970s, two groups of Americans were present throughout the country, missionaries and military. While the Western missionaries have since left, and South Korean churches have for decades been sending missionaries across the world, South Korean missionaries, over 28,000 U.S. troops are still stationed in South Korea, including the largest U.S. military base on foreign soil. The truth is, the United States has strongly influenced the religious, military, and economic landscape of the Korean Peninsula. As some of my South Korean colleagues say, we think of the U.S. as a Northeast Asia nation. Indeed, this includes the reality that a peace treaty cannot simply be signed by the governments of North and South Korea alone. Due to its role in the Korean War, the United States and also China must also sign a peace agreement. Given the U.S. history of intervention and presence in this part of the world, and following the lead of Korean people working for a new future, American people, American Christians, have a responsibility to assist in ending what has become the longest unresolved separation of a people in modern history. For many, the first step is by learning, lamenting, and praying. I'm talking about for Americans. This starts by Americans educating ourselves about the Korean War. For Korean people, Americans with Korean heritage, the war changed their lives and those of their loved ones forever. But most Americans know almost nothing about the conflict that falls between World War II, or the Pacific War, and the U.S. war with Vietnam. In 2020, 100 Korean American Christian leaders signed a statement of lament, asking American Christians to mourn the aftermath of the Korean War. Very few Americans are aware that 4 million people died in that war, including 2 million Korean civilians and 32,000 U.S. troops. They don't know that millions of Koreans were separated from their families by the war. and remains so even to this day. They don't know that the people of North and South Korea are almost completely isolated from one another. Among the drafters of that statement were Peter Cha of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Sung-Chan Ra at Fuller Seminary, Eugene Cho at Bread for the World, and you can see some of the others who drafted that statement. And here's what they wrote, part of what they wrote in that statement. We believe that God is faithful, that the arc of the universe bends toward justice, reconciliation, and beloved community. We pray that someday all Korean people, and including themselves, will be able to return to the birthplaces of their ancestors, to meet face to face across the peninsula, to recognize each other as sisters, brothers, and image bearers of God, unquote. And I should also add that a number of these leaders have family members who are in North Korea today. Now in part 3, the last part, I'd like to discuss proposed transformative practices towards social healing. So with these 3 challenges that I've named in mind, 3 challenges: the differing South Korean identities toward North Korea, the danger of a single story, and that danger is also in the North, of course, and the reality of U.S. power. I turn now to 3 transformative practices towards social healing. Transformative practices. The first transformative practice: from reunification to reconciliation. From reunification to reconciliation. In recent years, a number of South Korean scholars have begun looking to the tradition of Christian peacemaking and its implications for engaging North Korea. Methodist scholar Park Jun-sik writes, quote, the Anabaptist understanding of the gospel as a message of peace is crucially pertinent to South Korean churches. Yet, a strong anti-communist position has kept them from engaging reunification issues from a biblically informed perspective of reconciliation. It is crucial for the Korean church to construct a theology of reconciliation based upon the peace message of the gospel. For without forgiveness of the past history between North and South, genuine reunification is not likely, unquote. Developing a theology of reconciliation could have great consequences, not only for engaging the challenge of North Korea in a fresh way, but for divisions in the church, between the political left, the political right, between younger and older generations, between men and women. A theology of reconciliation can begin with the stories of characters in the Bible who, sensing God's call, crossed borders of division with a willingness to take risks, to engage face to face with a person or community their people feared or didn't understand. In Jesus' most famous parable, the Samaritan crossed the road to a stranger in distress, regardless of his ethnic identity or religious affiliation. Gospel of Luke. At the heart of the teaching of Jesus were perhaps the 3 most popular words Jesus ever spoke. Love your enemies. Difficult words. Book of Matthew, chapter 5. Empathy does not mean thinking the other, threatening other. It doesn't mean that they're not a problem. It doesn't mean that they might be wrong about some things, maybe many things. But what it does mean, it means having a curiosity about the dangerous other, to engage them as human beings, primarily as human beings, fellow human beings. Our primary identity is as human beings in this world. A curiosity to seek to understand why they do what they do, to meet face to face, not only to speak, but to listen. Let me give you an image of what this looks like today from the US side. For 25 years, American humanitarian agencies, including Christian agencies, have been the leaders in relief and development work in North Korea. This includes an organization called Christian Friends of Korea that does remarkable work on tuberculosis in the country. It includes Mennonite Central Committee, where I serve, which has provided food, medicine, most recently to support children recovering in hospitals and bringing North Korean agricultural scientists to the West. These Christian international NGOs are a face of compassion to vulnerable people in North Korea, to human beings who happen to live in North Korea. Such organizations worked in the North for over 20 years until the COVID-19 closure of the North Korean border in 2020. Due to hostilities between the US and North Korean governments, these staff and volunteers from organizations like MCC, World Vision, are among the few Americans who regularly visit North Korea for over 20 years. Through working alongside North Korean counterparts in areas such as health and agriculture, these Americans, and there were many South Koreans who did this during a certain period of time as well, these Americans challenged the story, the single story, that reduces the country's people to a hostile enemy by interfacing with North Koreans as human beings, traveling through the country together, working together, and even eating together. I want to show you a few images of that work of MCC. These are North Korean people, the border with China, where serious flooding happened about 6 years ago, and MCC helped provide food and resources in response to the flood. Let's take a look. These images. MCC's most recent work, which we hope to restart, hopefully soon, hopefully next year, is with children's hospitals, pediatric hospitals in Wonsan, Pyeongseong, and Sariwon. This is a nurse at one of those hospitals and a child being cared for. So I've traveled numerous times to these three places, and of course Pyongyang as well. There are different things that are part of MCC's support, humanitarian support. These are children at I forget which hospital this is, who are eating their lunch meal, and there is MCC canned meat, very nutritious. That's part of their soup. A number of these hospitals do not have clean water, so we provide water filter kits. Here's some images of a visit. I believe this may be Pyeongseol. Myself at the top left, meeting the medical director at the hospital. That's my wife, Donna, at the right. My wife is a nurse. She's with one of the mothers, and that's her child. The mothers come with the children to the hospitals because there aren't enough medical staff. Bottom left is my wife and a medical doctor on the left from MCC, consulting with the director at another hospital. MCC has a truck, a big truck, that is a meat canning operation on the truck. Volunteers, MCC volunteers in local communities, about 30 different communities, towns, cities in the US, Canada. The mobile truck comes to their community, and volunteers come and help can meat. They donate the meat. It's very, it's inspected by US government, Canadian government, very high quality, and it's done with great care and love by these volunteers. These are some examples of the sanctions from the UN and the US that create great difficulties in providing support. Our clean water kits were sanctioned at one point, baby kits, because they had a metal needle in them, not a needle, but a safety pin. But we've been successful in advocating for humanitarian exemptions and have been able to provide these once again, of course, until the COVID closure. We've also brought agriculture scientists to Canada, 2018 and another year. These are some of those scientists at our headquarters in Winnipeg, Canada. There they are, engaging a leading Canadian agriculture scientist, conservation agriculture, top left, and a farmer, bottom right, trying to learn how to improve techniques in the north. Here they are enjoying a meal with one of MCC's leaders, top left, and meeting a family, bottom right. Then in 2017 is 2018 delegation from DPRK of diplomats, including counterparts who we work with in the north, visited our headquarters in Canada, were with us for 4 days. And this is one of those leaders, bottom right, at the table across from the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, negotiating, leading up to the meeting between the leader of the North and the leader of the US. So those are some images. I look forward to discussion about that. Images of seeking to move from reunification to reconciliation to engagement. Second, transformative practice, social reconciliation, social reconciliation. This emerges from nations with deep division where social healing has happened in a significant way. The scholar Cecilia Clegg from the UK, she writes that in places of deep social division, such as East and West Germany before their 1990 reunion, Northern Ireland before its 1998 peace agreement, between North and South Korea today, the opposing sides view one another as what she calls threatening other. In such places, the quest for healing requires 3 dimensions of work: personal reconciliation, social reconciliation, political reconciliation. Personal, social, political. Personal reconciliation is the internal work that individuals must do. Political reconciliation is work which engages political power. In the case of Korean Peninsula, for example, this includes the need for a peace treaty. Now, according to the scholar Clegg, social reconciliation is the most overlooked work, and she contends that 3 turning points are required for a turn toward social reconciliation. I think each of them has great relevance for a divided Korean people. First, there must be a corporate will on each side to engage the threatening other. Secondly, there must be a willingness to renegotiate identities. And third, each side must come to realize that a new future of peace requires all parties to change. I'll keep those up there. Now, each of the South Korean identities toward North Korea, which I proposed, enemy nation, another country, disadvantaged sibling, they do not call for South Koreans to embrace or to engage. Let's say engage. Let's start with engage. To engage the threatening other. They don't call for renegotiating identity. They don't call requiring all parties to change. And this, by the way, this is, of course, this is true in the North, must also become true in the North as well. And I would also say in the US. So they don't call for identities to change. They don't call for these changes of social reconciliation. But the third transformative practice I want to talk about does speak to that change. Restorative justice. One South Korean whose identity was deeply transformed regarding North Korea was Reverend Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee Moksanim, not the president in the old days of South Korea, not that Syngman Rhee. Isungman Moksanim. Rhee Moksanim grew up in Pyongyang during the Korean War, where his father was a pastor. During the war, after communist troops killed his father, the pastor, his mother sent him and his brother to the South, and he joined the South Korean military to fight against the communists. Now, Rhee later immigrated to the US. He went to seminary, and during his studies, he joined the civil rights movement for racial justice and became influenced by the work of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he saw how King held together 2 things that are often held apart: work for justice, work toward enemies becoming friends. Now, Rhee became a Presbyterian church leader. And because of that influence from Dr. King, in 1978, Rhee Moksanim was one of the first Korean Americans to visit North Korea. His mission was not only to cross divides, but to see if his family was still alive after 28 years of separation and no contact. He discovered his mother had passed away only 3 months before he arrived. But he was united briefly with his brothers and sisters. When Rhee returned, he was criticized by a number of South Korean pastors and Korean American pastors for going to North Korea. After he returned, they called him balgengi, etc. And here we see that one community's vision to break the powers of mutual demonization can be seen by other communities as a traitorous threat. Later, Rhee served as the first Asian American moderator of the Presbyterian Church in the US. And Rhee was also one of my mentors in the work of reconciliation. Here's Rhee Moksanim on the left. On the right is Reverend Hiro Sekita from Japan, who both of them have now passed away, but both were leaders also for healing between Korea and Japan. And here they meet at a forum in Gapyeong, 2014, that I helped to organize, and they rededicated themselves to the work of healing between Korea and Japan. But one of the things that Sigmund said to me once is he said, Chris, reconcilers are bridges, and bridges get walked on from both sides. And that is also the work of social healing, of what we could call restorative justice. By the way, a vision that's gaining influence in South Korea, at work in prisons, in schools, with police, restorative justice. Now, polarized settings tend to be dominated by an either-or mindset. It's what I call oppositional thinking. We might think the same of a thumb and a forefinger. The thumb is opposable. Unlike other fingers, it can be placed opposite the fingers of the same hand. So if you try to pick up a pen, I'm trying to pick up a pen here without my thumb. And if you try to write, it's impossible, right? It's impossible. But by holding thumb and forefinger together, things are achieved that cannot be imagined. Opposable, not oppositional, opposable. That's what opposable thinking is. Holding two truths together in tension that are normally held apart. We may think we have to choose between forgiveness and justice. But as the psalmist tells us, they are opposable in the Psalm, Psalm 85. Mercy and truth are held together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. When seemingly opposed truths are held together, they open up greater truth. In contrast to justice whose goal is to punish a wrong, compensate the victim, and that punitive justice is what dominates in so many places, so many social, national conflicts, international. A restorative approach moves beyond punishment to repair the relationship and build a new community. Now, justice must be against oppression. It must oppose oppression. And I believe God is anti-oppression. But God's liberation, authentic liberation, is more than being anti this, anti that. True justice, I believe God's justice, moves towards a goal, a new future, a new positive reality. It moves toward what Dr. Martin Luther King called the beloved community. The author and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Elie Wiesel, was a survivor of the horrific Nazi Germany Holocaust that killed 6 million Jewish people. And as he wrote, we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. the same time, as Sigmund Rhee said, the work of reconciliation requires us to be bridges, and bridges get walked on from both sides. In the peacemaking work of restorative justice, these callings are not opposed, but like the thumb and forefinger, they are opposable parts, which only by being held together can be faithful to the task of healing that takes time. The fourth transformative practice, I think I might have said 3 earlier, but it's number 4. And this is the last one as I come to the end of this lecture. That's the statecraft of positive peace. The statecraft, the political work of positive peace. In the search for social healing on the Korean Peninsula, political power cannot be ignored. Political power is a source of great danger. At the same time, if political power is used with moral imagination, it can release enormous social goods, such as in countries that turned from military dictatorship to vibrant democracy. That's the good use of political power. A fresh political diplomatic approach is required on the Korean Peninsula, one of moral imagination. For example, unlike the challenge of racial division in the US, where blacks and whites are able to engage one another, even if they have deep disagreements, even if there's injustices, they can engage one another. They can talk. They can argue face to face. They can eat together. And something new can happen as they engage. But there is literally no space, as you well know, for ordinary South Koreans and North Koreans to engage one another, to debate differences, to address the wounds of the past. Creating space for that, creating space for social reconciliation requires political action. Also related to political power, recently scholars have shown that while policies of isolation and punitive pressure, such as sanctions on North Korea, have been vigorously applied, especially regarding human rights, nuclear weapons, they have failed to change the situation. Diplomacy guided only by pressure, which does not seek to engage, to understand the other, is dangerous and lacks moral imagination. As Nobel Peace Prize winner Nelson Mandela of South Africa, the first Black president of the country, 1993 Nobel Peace Prize winner, as he said, when we demonize our opponents, we abandon the possibility of peacefully resolving our differences, and we seek to justify violence against them. Let us think here about the United States and its enormous power related to the Korean Peninsula. The US has refused to pursue diplomatic relations with North Korea. But here's the thing. In fact, the US has diplomatic relations with many countries it doesn't like. Many countries it is in tension with, such as China. One moment with China occurred in 1971 when an American ping pong delegation visited China. Friendship matches led to intercultural exchanges and planted seeds for eventual diplomatic relations. It was a Republican president from the US, the conservative side, Richard Nixon, who visited China in 1972 and met with Mao Zedong, the totalitarian leader of China. And they met at a time when China had nuclear weapons. And they met not long after the Korean War, which the Chinese call the War of Resisting America and Assisting Korea. And there were 180,000 Chinese soldiers who died in that war. So it was also a US war with China. So they met. That meeting between Nixon and Mao helped to plant the seeds for diplomatic relations. In addition, in 1995, just 20 years after the US war with Vietnam, the US established diplomatic relations with Vietnam, which is still today a communist state. Since then, Vietnam War veterans, including the late US Senator John McCain, have become leaders in reconciliation initiatives between veterans from Vietnam and from the US, military veterans. It's quite extraordinary. Enemies are now friends. Given its potential to trigger a devastating war, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is one of the most dangerous peace and security issues facing our planet today. The fact that the US and North Korea have no diplomatic relations, no ongoing channels of communication, negotiation, and trust, this is dangerous. Disagreements, misunderstandings, and threats can easily escalate into conflicts and increase the risk of war. If diplomatic relations happened with China and Vietnam and the US, why not North Korea? Statecraft, diplomacy, is not a cosmic battle between good and evil. It is the pragmatic management of conflict where peace inevitably comes at the expense of some justice. After 70 years of a divided Korean peninsula, I propose that this positive peace approach is the politics needed for such a time as this. Now let me conclude. Peace dream people. Few of us can travel to North Korea to serve people with vulnerabilities alongside the doctors, nurses, and kitchen workers there. But all of us can work to provide what Mennonite scholar John Paul Lederach calls critical yeast. Critical yeast. Small but powerful actions that interrupt histories of distrust and hostility. Perhaps that critical yeast and new signs of transformation will emerge from some parts of a new generation of young South Koreans who are restless, who refuse to accept the divide as natural, normal, inevitable, because clearly history shows it is not natural, normal, or inevitable. Bae Min-jong is a young adult South Korean who I know. Min-jong did not grow up feeling the trauma of the divided Korean peninsula. For her, North Korea was always another country, and she had no interest, really, in North Korea. It's another country. But while she was in college, Min-jong joined a group from Korea, South Korea, that visited the China-North Korea border. And during this visit, their student group took a boat ride along the Yalu River to view the North. Now, the students were strictly instructed not to reveal they were Korean. And Min-jong told me she was full of fear. And as the boat went down the river, unexpectedly, suddenly, for the first time in her life, she saw two North Korean people sitting on a beach. They were soldiers. It was the first time she had ever seen North Korean people up close. The two soldiers put their guns down by the river, waved at the boat, and offered a greeting in Korean. Now, Minjong told me that she was shocked because one of them looked exactly like her younger brother. And for her, that moment was a turning point. Through that close encounter, she told me only then did I understand that we are one people. But all I could do was wave my hand as tears came into my eyes. When Minjong returned to the South, she redirected her life toward a passion for reconciliation. Each of those dominant identities toward North carries a powerful element of truth, each one of them. Enemy nation reveals that many people suffer deep trauma, which must be healed. And there are lots of enemy actions coming from both sides that must be faced realistically. Another country way of seeing North Korea reveals that engaging the divide is an immense cross-cultural challenge. The identity of disadvantaged sibling reveals a truth that the reality of a profound economic gap exists. Ruptured family reveals a truth also, that the divide between North and South Korea is not normal or natural. Together, these truths, each of these truths, reveals that the challenge of reconciliation, of moving from reunification to reconciliation, is enormous. And the pathway to a new identity of peacemaking carries a high cost. And by the way, that is true in every context of deep peace. Peacemakers pay a high cost. That's what comes with the job, friends, brothers and sisters. That is the job of peacemaking. But great change has happened in history, in East and West Germany, in Northern Ireland, in South Africa. Each of these places, deep, unexpected change has happened. If it has happened there, it can happen anywhere, can it? The practices I've proposed of social reconciliation, restorative justice, positive peace, do not erase the deep disagreements between the Korean people in the North and South, or between North Korea and the US. But those practices do connect us to the deeper transformative work of moral imagination. As the Korean American Christian leaders said in their 2020 statement, and this is where I close, I quote, "We believe our deepest motivation to engage the Korean divide is not political or economic, but as peacemakers and agents of reconciliation. Following Jesus' costly way of the cross, discipleship, forgiveness, and justice, which restores broken relationships. I invite you into the journey of moral imagination. And I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions and engaging with you. 감사합니다.